Yeah, so during the uprising in Sierra Leone, many atrocities were committed. The RUF had a particularly nasty habit of cutting off the hands of their enemies or any people that they thought were supporting the enemy. Now, Britain already was close, allied, if you like, with the government of Sierra Leone. It had economic links. Many British diamond mines British diamond companies owned the diamond mines in Sierra Leone, which of course were under threat from the RUF, who were targeting the diamond mines, trying to take them over and so on. The long and the short of it is Britain actually went in. Britain conducted its own humanitarian intervention at the request of the Sierra Leonean government and helped actually crush the rebellion and therefore end the civil war. I've heard that Tony Blair is quite popular now as a result of that in Sierra Leone. There's a lot of people, there was a bit of a spate of people in Sierra Leone calling their babies Tony Blair. And Sierra Leone has been relatively peaceful since Britain helped the government crush that rebellion. So arguably this is, because there are many examples of interventions that have seemed to have just led to chaos and instability. Sierra Leone is a good example of one that seems to have actually had the opposite effect and had put an end to a conflict that was there, ended the atrocities involved in that conflict and paved the way for an era of relative peace and stability. Then we have, so if you like, that was, despite everything I said about Kosovo as well, most of that information about the KLA massacring its opponents and so on when it came to power didn't really come out in Western media. The mainstream view of the Kosovo intervention was a wondrous success. So at that time, 1999, 2000, around that time, humanitarian intervention was kind of in an upswing. It was seen, look, intervention works. We've saved the ethnic Albanians of Kosovo, we've saved the people of Sierra Leone, we've brought peace and ended conflict in those regions and so on. Now this changed in the 2000s. This changed particularly, I would argue, and Andrew Hayward argues, because of the Iraq and Afghan wars. Now, it's important to note that neither of those wars are technically humanitarian interventions. They were not justified primarily on humanitarian grounds. The Afghan war was presented as a war of self-defense by the US and its allies, because in response to the September 11th attacks that they argued were committed by people with the support of the Afghan government. Al-Qaeda had training camps in Afghanistan at that time, controlled by the Taliban. And the argument was, well, the Taliban are sheltering these people who are attacking us, so as in self-defense we need to respond. So that was a classic war of self-defense, therefore it wasn't a humanitarian intervention technically. Same with Iraq, it wasn't technically a humanitarian intervention. The justification for the war in Iraq was, of course, that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, which was counter to a previous UN Security Council resolution forbidding him to do that. So neither of them were technically humanitarian interventions. Humanitarian reasons were never presented as the main reason for these wars. Nevertheless, humanitarian reasons were given as kind of secondary reasons to help sell the wars to populations. So even though the war of Afghanistan was primarily presented as a war of self-defense after 9/11, nevertheless, arguments were put forward by people like George Bush and Tony Blair that this is kind of in some ways also a humanitarian effort, because the Taliban are repressing women, so we're bringing women's rights to Afghanistan by overthrowing them. They were conducting other atrocities against their people. So there was a humanitarian aspect in the propaganda, if you like, to help sell those wars to people. The same with Iraq. Tony Blair said, well, whatever you want to say about WMDs and the legality of it, the truth is he was a brutal dictator, he killed his own people, so it was right to get rid of him. So he also presented a humanitarian aspect, that he was an abuser of human rights, a committer of atrocities, and we went in to make the situation better. So the fact that humanitarian reasons and human rights were used as a kind of secondary justification for these wars actually damaged the cause, arguably, of humanitarian intervention, because those wars were not popular, ultimately, in Britain or America. They had widespread opposition. Hayward gives 3 reasons why those wars were unpopular. He says, first of all, because there was no humanitarian emergency. It wasn't like in Kosovo or Sierra Leone, you could see, look, there's these massacres happening, we need to go in right now and prevent them. In Iraq, there had been atrocities committed, but about 15 years earlier, during the Iran-Iraq wars of the 1980s, there was no conflict happening in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was right at that moment committing massacres that the West needed to go in and stop. There was no humanitarian emergency. Same in Afghanistan. So they were seen as kind of illegitimate for that reason. Second reason these wars became unpopular was the body bags, the dead soldiers coming home. Hundreds of British soldiers killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, about 500, and thousands of US soldiers killed. This always makes it unpopular when it's your own people getting killed in a war. When it's other people getting killed in a war, that doesn't tend to be so unpopular. But when it's your own citizens and your own soldiers being killed, people start to question whether these wars are such a good idea. And thirdly, there was no improvement in the human rights situation in either Afghanistan or Iraq following these wars. In fact, by any measure, really, the situation is far worse today than in both those countries, even compared to under Saddam Hussein or the Taliban. That's pretty damning indictment of the impact of those wars. So, arguably, those wars on Iraq and Afghanistan damaged support for humanitarian intervention. They created a picture that actually intervention doesn't work. Often it creates more chaos and more instability and more conflict than it solves. So after this sort of high point of the Kosovo and Sierra Leonean interventions, seen as bringing peace and a great demonstration of how humanitarian intervention can really work, Iraq and Afghanistan led to a kind of a different popular understanding of intervention, that it actually breeds chaos and instability and terrorism and leads to deterioration of the human rights situation, if anything. So arguably as a result of that, there had been, when calls came from people like Tony Blair to intervene in places like Zimbabwe against Mugabe, or to intervene in Burma, Myanmar, or to intervene in Darfur in Sudan over atrocities taking place there was little appetite to get involved in those because humanitarian intervention had kind of got a bad name. There are other reasons intervention didn't happen in those 3 places as well, by the way. Another particular major reason, they had strong, powerful allies. So they were not isolated as Yugoslavia had been, for example, or as Afghanistan had been. Zimbabwe is closely allied with China, as is Sudan, as is Burma. All of 3 of them are quite close allies with China, which also means that it's less likely you're going to get an intervention because China, of course, could supply them good weapons to defend themselves and so on, and then it would be a different kind of battle. So following actually before either of those wars, but as the whole concept of humanitarian intervention was gaining ground, if you like, there were also concerns raised that actually humanitarian intervention poses a big problem for international law because it actually violates 3 of the major principles of international law. Firstly, as we've looked at, of course, state sovereignty. State sovereignty is clearly violated by humanitarian intervention. But secondly, self-determination, closely linked to state sovereignty, the idea that each nation has the right to determine its own future and so on. That's violated, arguably, by humanitarian intervention, and so is the principle of last resort, that military force should only ever be used as a last resort to deal with disputes between states and so on. Now, there's an argument with humanitarian intervention that because there's this urgency, massacres are happening right now, we need to go in right now and put a stop to them. That actually means that sometimes there's a push for humanitarian intervention before all diplomatic measures have been fully explored and so on. So sometimes the last resort principle of international law doesn't apply either. Last resort means you should try all other means of resolving a conflict before military force is used. But as I say, with humanitarian intervention, there's an urgency to use military force immediately before perhaps exploring all the diplomatic options. Just an example, Libya Colonel Gaddafi did offer, late stage admittedly, to negotiate with the rebels and so on and so forth, to have talks and so on. This was all rejected by NATO. They said, no, this is urgent, we need to put a stop to what's happening right now. So there's a danger that humanitarian intervention can actually undermine the whole basis of international law. Furthermore, there's of course a danger of states simply using the concept of humanitarian intervention to justify what are basically wars of aggression for their own selfish ends. Yeah, so any country could just invade another because it wants to take its resources or put an end to a government that it doesn't like and so on, and then just say, oh, we're doing it because for humanitarian reasons. So there's all this danger inherent in humanitarian intervention, that it can like open the door to just interventions all over the place. So for this reason, the Canadian government actually set up what it called the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, ICIS, I-C-I-S-S. The International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. It set this up in 2000 and produced a major report which became known as R2P, Responsibility to Protect, a new doctrine, if you like, governing the criteria for when humanitarian intervention would be considered legitimate. And R2P in 2005 was accepted by the UN General Assembly. In other words, it was accepted by a majority of the world states as a valid basis for humanitarian intervention. And basically the R2P doctrine, Responsibility to Protect, put forward by this commission, argued that humanitarian intervention can be legitimate, but only in two very specific cases and for two very specific reasons. One would be to stop or prevent large-scale loss of life. So if there are huge massacres being committed or there's a threat of huge massacres being committed, then going in to prevent them or stop them would be a legitimate form of humanitarian intervention. Secondly, to stop or prevent large-scale ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing is when you try to actually eliminate a particular ethnic group from a certain area, either by killing them or just driving them out of their homes and so on. And so if this is taking place on a